What is existence? What sorts of things actually exist? What is time? What is change and why does it happen? What are concepts? Are our choices free in a fundamental sense? These are just some of the questions asked in metaphysics. You may wonder what is the point of asking such questions, but the answers given to them influence how we think about other more everyday things, as well as important decisions, law and science. Metaphysics is not some weird form of occultism or pseudoscience. It is not just some fantastic speculation. It is the part of philosophy that studies the assumptions underlying our everyday thinking and even science, the most fundamental questions about reality. The term metaphysics comes from Greek ta meta ta physika, that which comes after physics, not that which is beyond physics, although that is also how some people have used the term. The physics here refers to Aristotle's books on natural philosophy, his scientific works. When his writings were being assembled much after his death in the 1st century Common Era, a selection of his writings was placed after the scientific works, hence that which comes after physics in the compilation. Aristotle himself had called these things first philosophy, which does seem apt, but the term metaphysics stuck. Metaphysics has traditionally included such subfields as philosophical theology, cosmology and ontology. There are also several specific questions that you probably have already heard of that belong to metaphysics, such as the question about freedom of the will, causality, the mind-body problem, and identity. Traditionally, philosophical theology was a big part of metaphysics. It is now usually seen as part of philosophy of religion, so I'll come back to it when discussing that branch of philosophy. Here it will suffice to say that whereas religious theology takes the existence of a God on faith, philosophical theology tries to use rational arguments to decide whether such things exist or not, or whether one is justified in believing in their existence at least. Cosmology, the study of what the universe is like, and cosmogony, the study of how the universe came to be, were also considered metaphysics in the past. Now these areas of study have been mostly taken over by scientific cosmology based on astronomy and physics. Questions about time and space are discussed more by scientists than philosophers, although they are still pretty philosophical questions, and philosophers well versed in physics may also have something to say about such matters. As we have already seen in epistemology, one's views about knowledge can be very closely connected to one's views about what existence is fundamentally, and what sorts of things exist. We will see that metaphysical views are also closely connected to ethics. We will return to those questions later, but first I have to explain all this stuff about existence and what is meant by the philosophical study of existence, ontology. It is the most important subfield of metaphysics. It is the study of being or existence and of the structure of existence. It is such a big part of metaphysics that the terms ontology and metaphysics are sometimes used synonymously. Approaches to ontology can be divided into existential ontology, formal ontology, and material ontology, as Antti Mattila and Seppo Nysönen do in the book Filosofian ydin. Existential ontology is interested in the difference between the existence of conceptual entities such as mathematical concepts like pi from real entities such as a poster, with the symbol of pi printed on it. Central concepts of existential ontology are 1. Temporality. Has the entity always existed, or has it come into being at some point in time and will it cease to exist at some point? 2. Alterability. Can the entity change into something else? And 3. Dependence. Is the entity independently existing, or does it require something else to exist? Formal ontology is interested in things like the causes of things and events, and the relationship between form and matter. For example, Hume's criticism of causality that I covered in epistemology is relevant here. What if there really is no such thing out there, but it is just a habit of thought, the result of the constant conjunction of events we have observed? Does everything or anything happen for a reason, as some people think? Is it possible to explain a phenomenon by appealing to what it will lead to in the future? We will later see how this was an important part of Aristotle's thinking. Material ontology is the attempt to explain what reality is fundamentally made of. The core concept here is substance. It is that something which does not depend on anything else and is what the entity is in its most fundamental sense. An object can be thought to have various attributes, such as size, weight, color, and so on, and substance is that which has those attributes, or what everything is fundamentally made of. Mattila and Nysönen give as an example something like this. Stubby is a child-friendly, playful male spaniel owned by the Wilson family. If we, conceptually, just in our imagination, not actually, remove Stubby's individual attributes, such as being owned by the Wilsons, being child-friendly, playful, and having the name Stubby, we are left with a male spaniel. We can still go on and remove the rest of the attributes, such as living, mammal, dog. And only now we are, perhaps, left with the fundamental substance of existence. You may realize that this kind of analysis is different from what could be done in natural sciences like biology, chemistry, or physics. These sciences study the attributes of things, but here we sought to go beyond them, looking for the substance in the most abstract sense possible. Philosophers have, as you might expect, suggested different answers for what that substance might be and what it might be like. Those answers can be categorized as forms of monism, if they think there is only one substance, dualism, if they think there are exactly two substances, or pluralism, if they believe the usually undefined number of substances is higher than two. The pre-Socratic Greek-speaking philosophers spoke of arche, some kind of first principle, which was possibly but not necessarily the same as our substance. Some of the most famous of these philosophers lived in Miletus, on the western coast of what is now Turkey. The first of them, and the first of known Greek philosophers in general, was Thales, who thought that everything was fundamentally made of water. His student Anaximander had a more abstract view. There is a fundamental substance, apeiron, meaning infinite or limitless. He does not identify it with anything familiar to our experience. Thales's other student, Anaximenes, was more conventional in thinking that the arche was air. Heraclitus from Ephesus said it was fire, and that everything is in constant change. You cannot step into the same river twice. Parmenides, who lived in Elia in Magna Graecia, which is now southern Italy, had an interesting worldview, taking monism to an extreme. He insisted against Heraclitus that change is actually an illusion. The existing, to on, is actually one whole, indivisible, timeless, changeless, perfect sphere. It is full of itself in the sense that there is no vacuum or nothingness within it. I feel I need to emphasize that this is not a description of our planet, but the totality of everything. It is a strange worldview, but Parmenides apparently arrived at this conclusion through rational thinking. For example, Parmenides thought that change is impossible because nothingness cannot exist, since it is not a thing. And so, something cannot come from nothing. It has to exist eternally or timelessly. If I understand his thinking correctly, he would have thought that for something to be separate from another thing, there would have to be nothing between them. But that is also impossible, as nothing is a contradiction. So there cannot be separate entities. The totality of existence is one unified whole. Monism in the extreme, like I said. Zeno of Elea, a student of Parmenides, is famous for some paradoxes that are meant to show how change is not possible. A paradox is a statement that appears to be true and false, or otherwise contains two opposite facts at the same time. Such a logical contradiction is generally understood to be impossible. Arguments leading to such a situation are also called paradoxes. Logical contradictions are supposed to result from Zeno's paradoxes. That is intended to prove that the situation or phenomenon, in this case change, is impossible. Perhaps the most famous of them involves a running competition between the hero Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles allows the tortoise a head start of some distance before running after it. But when Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise was when Achilles tried to reach it, it has moved forward some distance. And the same happens again and again, infinitely. And so Achilles can never catch the tortoise. The problem has much later been solved mathematically, but the solution was not known at this time. You can ask your math teacher to explain it if you don't yet know the answer. Simply put, the distance the tortoise actually manages to move when Achilles is catching up to it is eventually reduced to zero, not some tiny distance, as Zeno had thought. Another of Zeno's paradoxes means to show that an arrow does not actually move after being shot from a bow. You can think of an arbitrary point in the arrow's flight. The arrow is supposed to go through different points along the way from the bow to the target. It is at rest in each of those points. But if it is at rest, it cannot allegedly be moving. So the movement of the arrow must be illusory. Again, this seems a strange way of thinking, and I certainly think Parmenides and Zeno and their followers gave far too much credit to their ability to reason their way to the truth, but it was still better than just accepting whatever myths they had been told. That at least helped improve the conceptual tools available to us, such as mathematics. While his worldview doesn't seem to have been largely adopted by later thinkers, Parmenides' distinction between the truth on one hand and the illusion, or what we believe reality to be like, doxa, on the other, significantly influenced Plato, as you may have realized if you remember what I said about Plato's epistemology previously. I will return to Plato's metaphysics later, But before moving on, one final pre-Socratic philosopher must be mentioned. Empedocles from Akragas, now Agrigento, in Magna Graecia. He had a more complicated pluralistic worldview with not just one arche, but instead all the four classical elements, fire, air, water and earth, as well as two cosmic principles called love and hate. This view turned out to be very influential in Western thought well into the Renaissance, and in some ways even to our time, although not in science or serious philosophy. While these ancient ontological views have lost their popularity, except perhaps for their use as inspiration for fantasy stories and games, there are two types of ancient monism that have had a much greater and lasting influence on philosophy. These are idealism and materialism, and I will explain them in the next video. See you then. If you wish to support my channel, click thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already.